Hello everyone, welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Today in this session we are going to have a discussion on the newspaper of 29th of April 2024. So let's begin with our discussion. First, the list of articles that we have for today. So these are the 4 articles that we are going to discuss in detail. The first article is with regard to Israel-Iran relations and we'll discuss certain aspects of it. Then second is with regard to how RBI policies are now also looking towards mitigating effects of climate change. So we'll discuss that. Then one on the carrier aviation that we have in India. And then lastly, India's Chinese import bill and some of the significance of imports that we have from China. And then there are 2 articles from the prelims perspective. One, the NHRC accreditation status and something that is the review that is supposed to happen this week, and then lastly about anticyclones. So these are the articles that we are going to discuss in today's news analysis. So let's begin with our first news, and this is with regard to Iran-Israel relation, a 3-dimensional view of the Israel-Iran crisis. Now this is an article that we have today on your editorial page. So let's try to understand the various aspects of what this article has been talking about and some aspects beyond it as well. Now, what we have seen is that Iran and Israel, they have been in some kind of crisis for a very long time, and there has been a lot of animosity between the 2 countries. And when it comes to the present scenario, when we look at some of the statements that have been made by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he had stated once, there was an interview where he had stated that the 3 greatest threats that Israel was facing was Iran, Iran, Iran. So that is the view that they have had, and that's why it becomes very, very crucial, because he identified that Iran and Iran were the top 3 threats to Israel. Now, in this context, when we see this, he had emphasized that Iran was actively constructing an empire in the Middle East. And Netanyahu had been vocally against the Iran nuclear deal of 2015, which was later abandoned by President Donald Trump. It is something that was taken over by former President Obama, and then when Donald Trump came in, Donald Trump, when he came in, he simply had quashed it. Now, under the leadership, under Netanyahu's leadership, Iran has launched a very significant drone attack and missile attack that we know of, which happened on April 14th. And this marked the first time that a state actor has assaulted Israel in more than 30 years. And that's why this attack notably undermined Israel deterrence as well. And Netanyahu's even national security minister, even he described Israel's response as being feeble. And this, it's also a sentiment that reflects the restrained actions that follow the US advice despite the significant provocation that was done by Iran. And that's why the ongoing multidimensional crisis, it points towards Iran's increased willingness to take risks. So in a manner, you can say that Iran's risk appetite has been increasing. And you'll see that in a lot of cases. For example, when it comes to Iran, we know that for the first time, it's a direct attack that they have done on Israel. But before that, through a lot of non-state actors, there have been a lot of these things that have been done. Whether it is the various different armed rebellion group that we have in the different parts of West Asia and how they have been also acting against Israel. And all of these, most of these rather, they are being supported by Iran. So when it comes to the US, we have seen that for the US there is a strategic hesitation, and Israel's deep reliance on US is something that is not letting the things go further in terms of what Israel wants to do. So that's why we see that there are all these things that Iran, we know, that launched a significant drone attack, and this the response from the perspective of Israel has been termed as feeble by their own ministers. Now, the Biden administration, on the other hand, they have aimed to prevent the escalation of the Israel-Hamas conflict as well after October 7th into they do not want that it goes into and becomes a broader regional war. And that's why they have maintained support for Israel while also attempting diplomatic measures to stabilize the region as well. But when we look at US influence over Iran is also very limited, and that also complicates the efforts, because it's not that US has a very good diplomatic relations with Iran and they can have an effect on Iran's policies and whatever decisions are being taken by Iran. And what we saw was that after Israel targeted the Iranian embassy in Damascus on the 1st of April, which had killed senior Iranian officers, the US had actually anticipated an Iranian retaliation which could escalate into a regional conflict. And that's why what we see is that the US had interpreted most of the Iranian projectiles which were aimed at Israel. They said that 99% of the projectiles have been taken care of. And President Biden had urged Netanyahu to de-escalate this situation, avoid any kind of direct retaliation against Iran. Now, this approach is a part of a very long-standing shadow war where Israel has very frequently targeted Iranian interests, and a conflict which has been marked by relatively very minimal direct Iranian response until recently. This basically changes on April 14th attack, after which we have seen that Netanyahu also has faced a very limited, or rather you can say he has had very limited number of options due to US's, you can say, insistence on de-escalating the ongoing conflict in Gaza. And this has resulted in Israel conducting a very, you can say in a manner, symbolic strike in Iran, inside Iran, which was not even publicly claimed. That they destroyed, there were certain radars that were destroyed in Iran, and Israel did not even claim it. So Iran, now having faced repeated Israeli strikes with very little direct confrontation, has now reassessed its strategy. And this is a shift that has also been supported because of the stronger ties that they have with Russia and China, and a perception of reduced US's willingness also to engage in further Middle East conflicts. And after the Israeli attack on Gaza, which has very severe humanitarian consequences and international backlash, Iran has perceived an opportunity to change the dynamics altogether, and that's why it has resulted in its direct missile or drone attack that had happened on Israel. And despite a very comprehensive defense effort which involves multiple nations, some Iranian missiles had reached Israeli territory. And this is something that underscores a new strategic reality in the region as well, where Iran feels that they actually can directly challenge the US and the allies in this particular region. And that's why we see that they are now more confident towards also launching a direct attack against Israel. Now, what I would say is that this has been one of the views, that this is one of the ways in which the entire story is being discussed, that the US basically says that okay fine, we were able to intercept most of the Iran projectiles that were targeting Israel, and then after that we see that from the perspective of US, they have been decreasing their involvement in the entire segment of West Asia. Now, in this context, what we see is that the role of Russia and China also, they start to increase, because these are two countries, very strong powers, which are supporting Iran in this context. Now, so that's why what happens is that in this manner, this is where the confidence of Iran also increases, and that's why perhaps this time they have taken a step for the first time where a direct attack has been done, although many of the experts were of the view that Iran may not launch a direct attack because of the fact that Israel is far better in terms of its defense. But yet we saw that Iran took the step and Israel did not retaliate. Now here there is another view that many of the experts have shared, And the other view is that Iran, although Iran attacked Israel, but they also knew that Israel has a very powerful defense system, and most of the missiles and drones that are being launched towards Israel, they will be intercepted. So it's not that it is going to cause a lot of losses of lives. So even though it was an attack which they also knew would be taken care of, that it would be deterred by the Israeli defense. And along with it, what we saw with US and some of the other allies also looking towards destroying many of these attacks. So the other view is that Iran also knew that it's not going to cause a big humanitarian crisis as such. So it's not that Israel will also be prompted towards an attack here. And at the same time, Israel right now, we also understand that Israel is already fighting a war, and in this given scenario, how much they are willing to broaden this war is also something that many of the experts believe that perhaps right now they would not do, and they would keep their shadow war on, the way they have been attacking many of the Israeli outfits here and there, some of the rebel groups here and there, the kinds of attacks that they have launched in Iraq and Syria. So those kind of things might continue, but a direct conflict between these two countries perhaps will not happen. And it's in the interest of both these countries that neither Iran would want an escalation right now, nor Israel would want an escalation right now. Both of these countries, they are not in a position where they can let the things escalate further. And it's also in the global interest from the trade and economic perspective also that these two countries keep the peace as much as possible. So we have to see how the things go in the future and how the things shape up after this, but this is what looks to be right now. Now coming to the next article, again on your editorial page, towards green growth. Now this is an article which is talking about the Reserve Bank of India. The Reserve Bank of India has highlighted the significance of extreme weather events and climate shocks in the latest monetary policy report that had come in. And we had a discussion on that as well in our previous news analysis. Now, this is something that emphasizes the impact on food inflation and broader economy also. Now, this is something that becomes very, very crucial, that for the first time you can say that very explicitly the role that climate change can play and the impact of climate change on food inflation and broader way you can say on Indian economy is being realized, and they are now moving towards a step. They are starting to take steps where it might be useful for India to start preparing. And this focus includes the effect of the natural or the effect on the natural or the neutral rate of interest, which is a very crucial part of monetary policy. And it's a very crucial monetary policy tool which is used to balance the economic output and inflation control. Now the RBI is using a new Keynesian model with a climate risk damage function, which has been used to project a potential 9% decrease in long-term economic output by 2050. Now, in this particular scenario, they have incorporated a physical climate risk damage function to estimate the macroeconomic impact of climate change compared to a scenario without climate change. So what they basically are saying is that if there was no climate change, all right, if there was no climate change, then what the scenario could be, and if we factor in the problems of climate change, then what kind of problem could we see? And when they factor in climate change, this analysis has predicted a potential reduction in the long-term economic output by about 9%, by 2050, if no climate change mitigation efforts have been So what this analysis has predicted is that there is a potential reduction in long-term economic output by approximately 9% by 2050 if no climate mitigation efforts are undertaken. And there are also concerns that persistent inflation could lead to an unanchored inflation expectations, and this is something that would undermine the RBI's credibility and necessitating a higher interest rate, which would further diminish the economic output altogether. So that's why these are some of the things that become very, very crucial, that persistent inflation due to climate impact could lead to unanchored inflation expectations, and that's why it might lead to higher interest rates, which are going to be very poor for the economy and the economic output. So that's why we have to understand this. And since its July 2022 discussion paper on climate risk and sustainable finance, the RBI has been making strides towards facilitating India's transition into a green economy. However, when we look at the challenges are very considerable. The estimates suggest that India needs over $17 trillion to meet its net zero goals by 2070. So that's a huge number that we are talking about, 17. So over $17 trillion are required for the net zero target that we have for 2070. So that's why this is very, very crucial, and the RBI could look into an international example for guidance, such as the European Central Bank's development of a green taxonomy for the Eurozone, which has helped them define and categorize sustainable economic activities. And in the ASEAN region, an evolving green taxonomy has provided a model of how sector-specific sustainable pathways can be integrated into the economic planning as well. So that's why there are things that are being done, and these are the examples that can be taken. The practices that we have seen by the European Central Bank and ASEAN's evolving sector-specific green frameworks, they can be very, very crucial, or they can be very, very good examples in front of RBI. And you can say that RBI's issuance of 16,000 crores in sovereign green bonds and allowing the foreign institutional investors to buy into a future green government securities, these are some of the positive steps, and we had a discussion on this as well in one of our previous news analysis. So now this is where for the first time we can say that okay, these steps are now being taken, and we are going beyond just the discussions and reportage and analysis. So that's a welcome step, but a more extensive assessment of the quantitative and the qualitative impacts of climate change on economic and financial stability is very, very important, and this is where RBI has to take further steps. That RBI, along with, you can say, the finance ministry, should start building a comprehensive and a layered green taxonomy which is tailored to India's unique developmental needs and trajectories as well. And this is something that would help in addressing the transitional risks to the financial systems as India starts to progress towards a sustainable future. So that's why we need to understand that there are these steps that have to be taken by the RBI. We also have to go sector specific. We have to find out the ways, and we have to find out the means in which we can start becoming greener, in which the economy can start transitioning, because these are the things that are needed, because otherwise the analysis says that India's economic output will start decreasing if the mitigation steps are not taken now. So that's why these things become very crucial. Now coming to the third article, the significance of carrier aviation. Now overall, this is an article that describes the advanced stage and capabilities of India's naval power, and emphasizing significantly on the role of the aircraft carriers, that is INS Vikramaditya and INS Vikrant. Now overall, when it comes to these two carriers, INS Vikramaditya and INS Vikrant, they have demonstrated simultaneous operations, and they are showcasing India's advanced naval capacities. Now these carriers, along with the other naval assets that we have, they demonstrated a very complex twin carrier operations under the observation of India's Defence Minister Rajnath Singh, and this happened last month. And this is something that highlights India's growing prowess in the naval operations, and it is a kind of capability that is limited to a very few nations in the entire world. So that's why this was a big operation, this was a big success that we were able to showcase. Now, when it comes to INS Vikrant, when notably an indigenous, you can say, carrier in its design and construction, it marks a very pivotal development in India's naval history. And it is something that represents a shift from reliance on foreign technology to local innovation, particularly in the production of the warship grade steel that we have seen, the DMR 249 steel, which is now being used for all the warships in the country. And this is something that was achieved through a collaboration that happened between SAIL, or the Steel Authority of India, DRDO, and the Indian Navy. Now, the shipbuilding process incorporated significant technological advancements, for example, three-dimensional modeling, and the construction engaged in the, you can say, the substantial network of the MSMEs and the local labor, which also highlights its impact on the domestic industries as well. So that's why this becomes very, very crucial. And when we look at the specifications, INS Vikrant has been described as a marvel of engineering. It is equipped with state-of-the-art facilities to support its crew and the operations, and including advanced machinery for preparing meals as well, and maintaining very high operational standards. So there are all these things, and the ship has a very large flight deck and utilizes something called as the short takeoff but arrested recovery, STOBAR. So we know that they have very extensive facilities, including state-of-the-art kitchens and automated systems for even food production. For example, something like a roti maker is there on board, and it can support huge number of crew at the same time. So this, we have the STOBAR system as well. So STOBAR system stands for short takeoff, but arrested recovery. Alright. So now this is basically a system for aircraft operations. It enhances the operational capabilities altogether. Now, looking forward, the discussion basically is also something that shifts to the future plans for expanding India's carrier capabilities as well, with the proposed constructions that we see of another indigenous aircraft carrier called as the IAC-2. Now, this is something that aims to incorporate new technologies and improvements over INS Vikrant. So that's why we have to see and where exactly things go, because overall we do see that this has been a big achievement for India, and going forward India's naval prowess is only going to take further developments, and it is only going to enhance technologically as well. Now, coming to another important article, India's Chinese import bill up to 2.3 times in 15 years. Now, the Global Trade Research Initiative, or GTRI, it reported a significant growth in India's imports from China, increasing from about $70 billion in 2018-19 to $101 billion in 2023-24. Now, this surge in imports, it has led to China's share of India's industrial goods import escalating from almost 21% to 30% over the past 15 years. So from 21% to 30% in the last 15 years. Now, this study also highlights that this growth rate of imports from China is 2.3 times faster than the growth of India's total imports over the same period. So that's why India's imports from China as compared to its global imports have increased significantly by 2.3 times over this period. And China has become a leading supplier in 8 critical industrial sectors. For example, machinery, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, textiles. So that's why this becomes very, very crucial for us to also understand that, including machinery, chemicals, pharmaceuticals and textiles, we see that India's imports have been increasing in these sectors. Now, this is something that also contrasts with the common perception that China imports are predominantly electronic goods only. Now, this increasing trade deficit with China is now exceeding $387 billion over the past 6 years, which is a very huge concern for India. Now, this deficit, it also stems from a stagnant Indian exports to China, which is approximately around just $16 billion annually. It is so that's why this is something that is very significant from this perspective that we have to understand. Now this so despite a slight improvement that we have seen in exports of 90 principal commodities like iron ore or electronic components, which represent almost 67% of India's export basket to China. So that's why we have seen that although there have been slight improvements, when we look at the principal commodities. So 67%, or rather 67.7% of India's export to China basically come from iron ore, electronic equipments, etc. So although there we have seen a slight improvement, yet the things are way in the favor of China. Now further details, they also have revealed that in 2023-24, India's total merchandise imports were 600 and total merchandise import were 677, all right, $677 billion. $677 billion, and then here also 101 billion worth, out of this 101 billion dollars worth of goods were imported from China, which makes it 15% of the entire merchandise imports. So that's why we see that a significant portion of these imports, they also fall within major industrial product categories as well, and that's why making up to 30%, of such imports, where some of the products are even going beyond 70%. So that's why we understand that this becomes very problematic part for India, because the current data from the first 10 months of 2023-24 shows a very significant reliance on Chinese imports across various different sectors, and especially when it comes to some of the sectors. For example, when you look at textile and clothing, almost 42%, machinery 40%, electronics 38.4%, and iron and steel being 17.6%. So that's why we see that dependence on sectors like iron, steel, and base metals. These have come from, they have basically only been 17.6% of imports have come from China. So that's why this GTRI report, it stresses on the profound strategic implication of this dependency, which encompasses the economic and the national security concerns for India. And it recommends a reassessment of India's import strategies to mitigate these economic risks, try to strengthen the domestic industries, and to reduce the reliance on the imports from one single country. Now, also from this perspective, understand the implications of dependency on imports from China. What are the problems that we could face? Let me take a blank slide and give you certain examples. Yeah. So when you look at some of the implications that we could have, is that first you have to understand the simple factor of the economic vulnerability. Economic vulnerability, that India's increasing dependency on the imports from China, especially in critical sectors like the machinery or pharmaceuticals, chemicals, electronics, etc., it exposes the economy to vulnerabilities which are related to supply chain disruptions, and any geopolitical tension or economic policy changes in China could directly impact the availability and pricing of all these essential goods in India. So that's why we have to understand that how it can lead to an economic vulnerability in India. Then at the same time, another factor that we have to understand is of industrial stagnation. Industrial stagnation, that heavy reliance on imports for core industrial components, it can strive the growth of domestic industries. This could lead to a lack of innovation within the local industries, as they might not invest in research and development if cheaper imports are readily available from China. Then it of course leads to trade imbalance as well. The significant trade deficit with China, which has been growing over the years, is a major concern. And this not only affects the foreign exchange reserves, but it also reflects an imbalance in the trade relations that could have a broader economic repercussions for India. So that's why from this perspective, another implication of this problem could be the trade imbalance. Right? Trade imbalance. Now, all these factors, they have very strategic risks for India. First, we discussed, for example, it could have a problem associated with national security of India. Dependence on imports for essential sectors, pharmaceuticals, electronics, etc., they pose a national security risk where critical infrastructure might be susceptible to foreign influence or disruption. And then at the same time, it can have an economic influence as well. So first, it could have So first thing is from the perspective of national security. The risks that we can, this is about the risks, and this was about the implications. So now, so one is national security, second is the kind of economic influence that it can have. Right? China's position as a major supplier gives it very substantial economic leverage over India, which could be used in maybe diplomatic or geopolitical conflicts to exert pressure on India. And it also leads to loss of domestic capabilities. Over reliance on foreign imports can erode India's indigenous industrial base, and that's why it could reduce its ability to be self-sufficient and to control the economic future of the country. So that's why it can lead to loss of domestic capabilities. All right. Now, at the same time, we have to think, okay, fine, okay, these are the issues and this is what can happen. But what are the measures? What could be the measures to reduce the trade deficit, to enhance the domestic capabilities, to promote the domestic industries, etc.? First thing is that the government could incentivize the growth of domestic industries through maybe subsidies, tax breaks, support for research and development, and some of the special emphasis should also be so let's say if we are talking about what could be done, right? What could be the measures? What could be the measures that the government could take? So from this perspective, it could be first about incentivizing. Incentivizing domestic industries. Incentivizing domestic industries. So first it could, and again a lot of things, either it could be through subsidies or through tax breaks, right? Or maybe also support for research and development. correct? At the same time, special emphasis should also be placed on developing sectors where India relies heavily on imports, correct? So this is one. Then also diversification maybe of import sources to reduce the dependency on any single country. India should also look to diversify its import sources across different geographies. This could involve, let's say, strengthening trade ties with some of the other countries in Southeast Asia, or maybe Europe, or maybe in North and South Americas. So that's why one more factor here could be diversification. So it could be diversification of import sources. It could be diversification of import sources. And then after this, it could be about maybe enhancing the export competitiveness as well, improving the quality and the pricing of Indian exports through technology upgradation and better market access can also help in balancing the trade deficit. And special zones and policies to boost the exports can also be considered. So that's why we have to try and enhance export competitiveness. And this basically can come from point number one, because if you strengthen the domestic industries and the capabilities, it will lead to your improvement in export capabilities as well. And then maybe strategic trade agreements. India should try and negotiate trade agreements that allow for import of essential goods at reduced tariffs from countries other than China. And that's why it could help in reducing the cost disadvantage of diversification also. So that's, otherwise what happens is that, let's say you go to a country X and you say that, okay fine, we are trying to reduce our dependency on China, so that's why we want you to be the supplier. They know that they are at an advantage, so they can charge a higher price, because India is just trying to get away from that dependence on China. So maybe cost competitiveness is not the first thing that we are looking at, and probably we are just trying to diversify. So there could be a cost disadvantage of doing this, because that country knows that they hold an advantage because India is trying to get away from Chinese imports. So that's why from that perspective we have to negotiate these deals as well. And that's why in this context, strategic it becomes very, very crucial to have strategic trade agreements. All right. And then after that, maybe also having or maybe building strategic reserves for critical material like pharmaceuticals and electronics. India should consider to also create strategic reserves to cushion against any kind of supply chain disruptions that may potentially happen. So that's why from this perspective, you can also think of building strategic reserves. Building strategic reserves. And then lastly, most importantly perhaps, skill development. Skill development. Investing in skill development to ensure that the workforce can meet the demands of the new and the emerging technologies domestically is also something that can become very, very crucial for India going forward. So that's why these are the things that we have to understand from the perspective of this article, and going beyond the article to understand the future of what can be done. Now coming to the prelims based articles, the first article that we have is NHRC accreditation status faces review in Geneva this week. Now this is an article that we will discuss perhaps in detail again sometime next week after everything happens. But before it happens, let's have a just quick look at where we are right now and what's happening currently. Now what we know is that the National Human Rights Commission of India is set to defend the country's human rights practices at an important meeting that will happen in Geneva, and we will be aiming to maintain the A status in the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions, that is GAN-HRI. Now, in this context, so we want to retain the A status that we have at this particular event. Now, the review, it is happening as a part of the 5-year cycle, which is very, very crucial, because A status enables the NHRC to vote at the United Nations Human Rights Council as well, and certain UN General Assembly bodies also. So that's why this is very, very crucial for India to have this status with it. Now, so why it is crucial, just understand two important points: that if we have the A status, then we are able to vote at any UN, at any human rights council and certain UN General Assembly bodies. So we'll be able to vote in them, otherwise we'll not be able to. Now, the NHRC's status was deferred in 2023 due to concerns about the composition, including the use of police in investigations and insufficient gender and minority representation altogether. Now, these issues, they were highlighted in a March 2023 submission that was done by Subcommittee on Accreditation, which critiqued the presence of government officials in the NHRC in India and the lack of diversity, reflecting concerns over the potential government interference and a lack of inclusivity in its operations. And that's why this meeting is happening for the second time under the present government, that NHRC where faces potential downgrade in its ranking. Historically, what we have seen is that India has been able to retain its A rating in 2006 and 11 after initially being accredited in 1999. But then we saw that in 2016 we had faced this kind of a review problem also, and for the upcoming review, the NHRC has plans to participate online, and it will try to receive the support. What we have seen is that the ministry, for example, the Ministry of External Affairs, it has been engaging in diplomatic outreach to try and bolster the case of India. Meanwhile, some of the leading human rights organizations like the Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, they have urged the council to downgrade NHRC's rating due to the ongoing concerns about the restrictions on civil society and discrimination, particularly in the lead up to the general elections. Now, this is where we see that we have seen a lot of animosity between the government and some of these organizations like the Amnesty International and the Human Rights Watch, etc. We have seen that by and large there have been many of the disagreements between these organizations and India, and that perhaps is also leading to these kind of things. So for example, when they say that, okay, this is a very generalized statement to make many a times, that okay, this government is the one that because of the elections they are going to discriminate, they are discriminating against anyone and everyone. So these are very generalized statements, and that's why what happens is that many a times when they take it up to the international events and when it gets highlighted internationally, this is where India many a times has had to defend its status. That despite the international scrutiny, what we have seen is that the official sources have suggested that the government is very confident that we will be able to retain the A status that we have, and it is not solely focused only on the external validations of the human rights record. So that's why we have to see and understand where it goes. But again, this is something that will be a developing story in the coming week as well. Now, coming to the last article of the day, anticyclones hanging even now over India, link warming to heat. Now, before we go on to understand what this article is saying, let's just try to understand what are cyclones and anticyclones. Now when we say cyclones, we know that cyclones basically are weather systems in which the air rotates in a counterclockwise direction in the northern hemisphere and clockwise direction in the southern hemisphere, correct? So this is what we see in cyclones, and this rotation is something which is due to the Coriolis effect, correct? Now cyclones are associated with rising air, which typically will lead to the cloud formation and then precipitation, and they can range from very mild depression systems to very intense systems such as cyclones, the tropical cyclones and hurricanes and typhoons, etc. Correct? So this is basically what we see in cyclones, right? In cyclones we see that there will be a rise, and this will lead to the formation of cloud and eventually leading to precipitation. So that's why some of the key features that we see for cyclones is that cyclones will have a low pressure at the center, and the air moves towards the center and rises, right? Air moves towards the center and it rises, and this is something that leads to cloud formation and very often leads to precipitation as well. And they can basically cause very severe weather such as thunderstorms, very heavy rains, and maybe in very severe cases it can lead to cyclones, hurricanes or typhoons. So this is what we see when it comes to cyclones, correct? In case of cyclones, this is what we see, that that there will be low pressure at the center, correct? We know that there will be low pressure at the center, and then what we see is that air moves towards the center and rises, correct? So air moves towards the center and rises, right? And this basically would lead to cloud formation and precipitation. So this is typically what cyclone is. Now coming to when it comes to anticyclones, that what are anticyclones? Anticyclones, of course, they are the opposite of cyclones, where air would rotate in clockwise in the northern hemisphere and counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere around a region of high pressure. Alright, so this is why we see that it is an anticyclone or opposite of cyclone. So what do we see here? That first thing that we'll see is that in the context of anticyclones, we'll see that the air rotates clockwise in air rotates clockwise, alright, clockwise in the northern hemisphere and anti-clockwise in the southern hemisphere, and this is something that is happening around the center or around a center of high pressure. So you have high pressure at the center. You have high pressure at the center, as you can see in this diagram, that you have high pressure at the center in anticyclones and low pressure at the center in case of cyclones. Now the air in anticyclones, they descend from higher atmosphere and warming it as it does so, which inhibits the cloud formation and leads to clearer skies. So overall what happens is, that's why it is also related to heat. So what we see is that the air in anticyclones, they would descend from, as you can see here, that they would descend from high pressure, and this would lead to warming of will have a warming effect, and so as it does so, it also leads to clearer skies, correct? It leads to clearer skies, and here it will lead to warming. So that's why the key features of anticyclones first would be that they have high pressure at the center and air moves away from the center as it descends, and generally leading to very stable and clear weather. So that's why they are very often associated with dry weather, and they can bring heat waves or sometimes cold spells as well, depending on what kind of season it is. So that's why, just to add one more point, so air, as we had seen in cyclones, just the opposite of this, that air moves away from the center. Alright, air moves away from the center as it descends, correct? As it descends. And this is something that will leading to stable and clear weather. Leading to stable and clear weather. And that's why what we see is that very often they are associated with dry weather, and they can bring heat waves or cold spells depending on what season it is happening in, correct? So they will bring in dry weather. Again, just the opposite of cyclones, dry weather. So that's why they can lead to either heat waves or cold spells depending on the weather. Alright, so right now what we see is that what's happening is also being associated with anticyclones as well. The kind of heat waves that we are seeing in India, we are associating it with anticyclones. So that's why this article basically discusses the complex interplay between global warming and local weather patterns, particularly focusing on the role of anticyclone circulations in driving unusual weather events like the heat waves and very intense rainfall sometimes in India. So when we look at the various aspects of it, the very first thing is we have to see how global and local climate modelings are different. The global warming influences the local weather is something that we know, and it also necessitates us having models that can consider both global dynamics and the local variation to also accurately predict the weather patterns. And in case of El Nino's impact, what we understand is that the declining phase of the very strong 2023 El Nino has brought global temperatures becoming very warm, and that is something that contrasts with the cooler temperatures in some of the regions stretching from Pakistan to even parts of India, even up to West Bengal. Now this anomaly that persisted throughout 2023 despite a very general trend of rising temperatures globally is something that brings this to notice. Now heat waves in India, they basically have been increased because of anticyclonic circumstances, and this is something where we particularly see that because of their timing, they are very difficult. They are making the situation very difficult in India because they are coinciding with El Nino, correct? So that makes the situation worse, and then particularly also the concern due to the timing with the general elections as well. Now anticyclones, which are characterized by clockwise wind patterns and sinking air, they would basically warm the surface by compressing and heating the air, and that's why they create kind of heat domes altogether. Now in this process, what we see is that during the pre-monsoon season in India, there is a setup of upper layer jet streams, the Indian easterly jet streams and westerly jet streams, and they foster the development of anticyclonic patterns. Now these patterns, they can either bring very dry hot weather or milder conditions depending on the strength of the anticyclone. So that's why what we see is that when it comes to the unprecedented warming that we saw in 2023, which exceeded the expectations based just on El Nino effects alone, they suggest a very significant influence from additional warming factors, and that's why interaction between El Nino and the Indian easterly jet, they likely resulted in a more persistent and intense heat waves as well. So that's why there are all these things that we have to understand. Now there is a system called as the ready set go system under you can say how exactly it is trying to aiming at improving the disaster preparedness through accurate forecasting in India. Now, three aspects: ready, set, and go. Ready basically is for providing a seasonal outlook to guide a long-term preparation. Then set is resource allocation based on external forecasts, or you can say the predictions, basically the sub-seasonal predictions, and then implementing the mitigation actions based on the short and medium term forecasts that have been done. So that is what go is. So in this way you can say that despite having improvement in the prediction accuracy, there are challenges that remain in predicting specific weather events locally, and efforts to forecast at a decadal you can say scales, they have shown promise, and they have been trying to aim at enhancing the resilience and preparedness from national to the local levels. So that's why there are all these things, and that's why this article emphasizes on the critical need for precise local prediction given the global climate phenomena and the evolving capability of India's meteorological and disaster management system to try and respond effectively to the climatic extremes that we are all looking towards. Now lastly, let's look at the mains questions for the day. First question: examine the implications of India's increasing dependency on imports from China. We discussed about this. Discuss the strategic risks associated with this trend and suggest measures for reducing India's trade deficit while enhancing domestic industrial capabilities. So these are the things that I had explained you when I had taken that blank slide. So you have to derive your answer from all those points that we had discussed in that particular article. Coming to the second question: examine the role of Reserve Bank of India in addressing the challenges posed by the climate change to India's economic and financial stability. So again, something that we have to discuss, that how going forward RBI has to take steps, and discuss the measures undertaken by the RBI, green bonds, etc. You have to discuss here, and suggest further actions needed to enhance the country's resilience against climate related economic disruptions. So this is where you can talk about what has been done by European Central Bank, what ASEAN has been doing, how they have been looking at sector specific taxonomy. So those are the things that you can discuss while writing this answer. So this brings us to the end of today's discussion. I hope that this discussion is going to be helpful for you. Thank you very much for being here.